Day 3 of National Distance Learning Week, our 15th anniversary edition. Before we get started and I introduce to you our wonderful speaker today, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. From our gold sponsor category, we have D2L, Instructure, Logitech, NC SARA, Poly, Tennessee State University, TDU, Verizon, and JDL Horizons, through whose platform we are coming to you live in English and Spanish. Many thanks to our silver sponsors, EDU Alliance, Harmonize, IntelliBoard, Information Age Publishing, Nearpod, Yamaha, and Yellow Dig, as well as our bronze sponsors, AnatoMage, Arizona Telemedicine Program, Southwest Telehealth Resource Center, Enrollment Resources, Proctorio, Video 360, Viopta, Virtual Care, Xanadu, and also thank you to our USDLA friends. We appreciate all of you for your contributions to making this conference and events like these possible. If you are not a member of the United States Distance Learning Association, we extend a warm invitation to you to join us as a member or to join us as a leader. If you'd like to serve on the board of directors, please contact any one of us and we will be happy to tell you how to get started. This summer, please mark your calendars for July 17th through 20th. We're going to be in Orlando at our national conference for 2023. Just about every Friday, we have webinars. We also host a number of forums that we warmly invite you to benefit from. Please join us on LinkedIn. We have an active group there, and we're also active on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We are joined today by two co-hosts, Mr. Pat, let me see if I can stop the share. There we go. Pat Casella, who is our executive director and past president, and Ms. Wendy Pate, who is chairwoman of our awards committee. So actually, Wendy, if I could impose on your kindness to tell us a word or two about the awards.
Sure. We are in the process of solidifying the categories for the USDLA awards. We expect to have them ready to go the beginning of December and posted on the usdla.org website. Most likely what I'm shooting for is before December 15th. So what you would like to do if you're interested in submitting an award, please watch the usdla.org website under the awards category across the top. There's already a page started for the 2023 awards. So keep your eyes there.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And now I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing someone who's been very influential in my career, someone who inspired me to conduct research with Chief Online Education Officers, Dr. Melanie Shaw. Dr. Shaw has over 2 decades of educational experience ranging from classroom teaching to counseling and higher ed administration. She's a professor at National University. She also serves as a contributing faculty member at several other institutions. Dr. Shaw's primary research interests include online teaching and learning, organizational leadership, and distance learning instructional practices. She's author of several books, articles, and chapters, including an evaluation of student outcomes by course duration in online higher education, also establishing an online professional development community to promote faculty engagement and excellence. Other titles include Distance Learning Courses, a survey of activities and assignments, also Online Course Activities, a survey of assignment and assessment types. She is the winner of the Wagner Award for Outstanding Instructional Support, as well as the Online Learning Consortium's Effective Practice Award. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Shaw. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am just thrilled to have an opportunity to spend the next hour with you all, sharing my research and also some musings about this critical leadership role that we have yet to really accurately defined. So we're going to be talking about that and talking about some of the research around best practices for this role of the Chief Online Learning Officer. As Gio noted, I am a professor at National University, and I have spent the bulk of my career in online education. I like to tell people that we were doing online education before it was really cool. And I know that I am among colleagues and like-minded friends here in this space today. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share with you. Let's go ahead and get started here. The Chief Online Learning Officer is really a key role in higher education, and it's become even more apparent how important this role is in light of the pandemic. With the disruption in educational practice that was caused by an unintentional shift to online learning across many institutions, the role has really grown in importance and visibility. In this presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the key skills that are needed to advance leadership in the online space, and also some of the things that are needed to undo some of the harms that were caused by poorly implemented and actualized online learning over the past few years. I'm hoping that at the end of this presentation, you will come away with strategies that you can apply to your own online context to promote success for all distance education stakeholders. We're in this because of the students. So I always like to keep the students as the central focus of my thinking about my own professional practice. But as you'll see, as we start to talk about some of the skills needed in this Chief Online Learning Officer role, this role touches many different stakeholders, including faculty groups, staff, leadership within the higher education administration, and also, of course, students. What we've learned over the past few years is that many institutions had particularly strong online learning programs before the pandemic. These institutions were easily able to adapt to the changing landscape that occurred when all of a sudden we were forced to pivot very quickly from face-to-face learning to online learning. Unfortunately, the majority of higher education institutions had siloed online programs, and as a result, the pivot really created a lot of chaos. One of the important things that I got to do very early in the pandemic was serve as a trainer for some professional development offerings to help faculty at institutions that didn't have an online program learn how to very quickly modify their curriculum and move their instruction online. What I heard from those faculty at institutions that didn't have a strong, robust online program was that faculty felt a lot of fear, and as a result, a lot of resistance to some of the best practices that we know are important to ensuring student success. So it's really interesting to think about sort of the haves and the have-nots in terms of institutions that were doing online well before the pandemic, were able to adapt to the changing landscape versus those that had very siloed programs or even no programs at all. And hopefully the skills that we discussed today, you'll find value in those, no matter what one of those camps your institution falls into. I wanted to start by sharing one of the funniest memes that I saw come out of the early days of the pandemic. You've got the Scooby-Doo gang here unveiling the villain, and Zoom became such a huge player in what we did in the online space during the pandemic. And I think we all learned some new vocabulary, things like Zoom fatigue, that we didn't even know were things we needed to consider prior to 2020. one of the things that the role of the Chief Online Learning Officer is really going to have to do is to walk back some of the damage that happened from unintentional online offerings. And by unintentional, I mean those that not only weren't planned, but weren't structured to support the transition to online. Prior to the pandemic, I became very interested in the idea that this new role was emerging in our online space that was this executive role that was required at institutions really agnostic of type of offering and type of student service. In fact, this role really kind of grew out of the awareness that the Chief Information Officer wasn't the right person to drive online strategy. And so early in 2016, some colleagues and I got interested in exploring what exactly it means to serve a role in this chief online learning space. And some of the skills that we identified that were really critical were things like higher education leadership experience. We saw that people in this role really needed to understand how to manage personnel because they were hiring, they were contracting with instructional designers, they were supporting faculty transition to online teaching. So that personnel management was really critical. We also found that these folks really needed to understand how to do faculty development well, because they were in a role where they were needing to help faculty and instructors gain the skills that they needed to transition to online and to migrate their curriculum online. As a result, they also needed instructional design skills. They needed to understand enough about technology to be able to leverage the tools that were needed to do curriculum well. They needed to understand best practices and teaching skills. They needed to understand how to build relationships. This is a key leadership skill that was needed to not only sort of diplomatically smooth over some of the angst around this evolving learning environment, but also to promote buy-in from stakeholders across the institution. These individuals also needed to know about budgeting, about the development of mission and vision. They needed to understand accreditation standards, factors that influence student success, how to ensure quality. They also needed to know how to develop and create resources to support online programs. They needed to know about social engagement, faculty and student support, evaluation and assessment, and accessibility. So you can imagine this wide swath of skills is not something that most people come into a role having all of this knowledge. So we were interested in, how do we develop these skills and where do they come from and what are the kinds of preparation that these leaders need to have in order to do this well. It's really interesting to consider that this role is a lot like a provost or some role that oversees so many varied aspects within the institution that it's bigger than like a program director or a dean or it really does kind of touch on all operational areas of the institution. Our wonderful moderator, Gio, took up this idea of what this role needed to encompass and look like. And she did some excellent research that if you haven't read her research, I would highly encourage you to do so, because her findings really shed some light on this conversation. In her research, she found that legitimate power has a strong effect on overall quality of the online offerings. So what we learned from her research is that the title that the individual holds in this role, the reporting structures, both up reporting and down reporting, and the level of influence that this individual has really matter. And so when we think about the positionality of this role, it really does need to be seen as a top leadership administrator. And that's really the only way that this role can be executed effectively. And that legitimate power has to be there for the kinds of quality that we seek in these programs to be able to be actualized. During this time in the pandemic, our educational institutions, by and large, when the disruption happened, remember we were sort of in the middle of that spring semester for most traditional institutions in terms of their course pacing. They were, it was really kind of in the middle, like March, when we realized, oh my gosh, we have to make some big changes to how we're delivering content in light of this pandemic. And all of the shutdowns were happening. And so in order to maintain the educational continuity, a lot of our institutions decided to continue through the semester, pivoting midway to online. And this was seen as an important consistency and continuity effort. But what we know in hindsight is the failure to sort of push pause in the middle of that semester, reacclimate to the new reality, and then prepare and build and move forward. The failure to do that created some real chaos, not only for our institutions, but for faculty and for students. And again, always keeping students as that central stakeholder in the equation. Without them, we wouldn't be here. The initial challenge for faculty and students was the struggle to accept this transition from the ways of learning that had always been to new ways, and there wasn't enough time to plan and adjust accordingly. In a lot of cases, not only did the faculty not, but the students not have the knowledge and skills and even technology tools to do this well. And so we really created quite a disruptive shift during that time. The research consistently shows, however, that institutions that had a strong online program prior to the pandemic fared better overall. So if we think about that legitimate power, right, we can assume that those institutions had effective chief online leaders who were helping to shape that transition and doing that well during that time. With the shift to distance learning or online offerings across most institutions, the need to ensure leaders had the skills to execute this and have the skills is really paramount. And it's really our task at hand today as we talk about this role. One of the interesting things to think in higher education, we tend to have such clear naming conventions for roles, right? Chief Information Officer, CEO, Provost, Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dean. Yet this role has not yet congealed around a particular title. It can be called everything from Chief Online Executive to Distance Education Dean to Director to Program Director, Vice Provost or President of Online Education, among others. In our case, we're just going to default to the Chief Online Learning Officer as a convenient naming strategy that kind of captures, hopefully, an umbrella for understanding of the skills and the power necessary for this role to execute well in higher education. Because of the ambiguity around a naming convention for this role, it's easiest often to define what this is, not by a title, but rather by the experience this individual brings to the task and the job descriptions that they hold and are accountable to. So prior to the pandemic, some colleagues and I conducted a comparative analysis to find out what some of the job responsibilities were, and then also juxtapose that against what some of the expectations for performance were that were outlined in the literature. Knowing that so much has changed as a result of the pandemic, I reconducted an analysis using the same constructs to kind of update the findings. So I want to talk with you about that today. What I did was I looked at job vacancy postings for this chief online learning officer type position. And that is the position overseeing the online education activities at a higher education institution. And looked at those hiring criteria. And I looked across a wide swath of institutions. I looked at for-profit and not-for-profit colleges and universities, state institutions, private colleges, and land-grant institutions, because I wanted to see what was happening across this role, agnostic of institution type. So in 2016, that study that I mentioned to you that some colleagues and I conducted appeared in a publication for UPSEA. And in that research, some of the skills that emerged were that this leader has to have an understanding of trends. They really need to have their finger on the pulse of sort of what's happening in the online learning space. They need to understand strategic demands. They have to have a comfort level with technology and also curriculum, because so much of what this role does is overseeing the expansion of offerings. While many senior leaders within an institution may possess some generalized knowledge of these things, what's really needed in this role is a specialist who can focus exclusively on the online cache that's necessary for effective management and operation. This online executive or chief online learning officer role is really distinct, as I noted earlier, from the chief information officer, who focuses on more like the procurement of and processes around technology. In contrast, this chief online learning officer is really focused on student access, online delivery, digital engagement, strategy and alignment with mission and vision of the institution. What was interesting when we looked at the kinds of backgrounds that these leaders emerged from, there was really a huge variety of professional experiences, but there was one unifying feature that we found, and that each one of these individuals shares a passion for innovation in higher education. So that seems to be the one unifying calling card for this particular role. It's hoped that one of the things that most emerged from the pandemic is the recognition that this particular role is a valued strategic partner. And I'm hoping that institutions that were resistant to having this kind of an individual overseeing the online programs within the institution are now much more embracing of that idea, because of course it requires funding and commitment to make something like this be successful. What we saw in our early research and in the literature is that this role must collaborate across the institution. Frederickson, who did a study in 2017, identified some of the unique skills required. In the study that was conducted, a majority of the folks in this role had 6 to 20 years of leadership experience, and 75% of those came from an online teaching background. So that's really an interesting point to consider, that the majority of folks who are called to this role come from an online teaching background, have had that experience, and it shaped their desire to be in this sort of innovation officer kind of role. Most of them had significant curriculum and instructional design experience, and 60% had at least 1 year of IT experience. So again, that technology piece, we're not expected to be sort of overseeing technology, but understanding how to leverage technology seems to be a really important point. So the effective selection of a candidate for this role, it really requires a keen understanding of the leadership competencies that are needed. So in hiring for this position, our presidents and chancellors and provosts, whoever is making some of these hiring decisions, should think about how well this role will be able to promote organizational strategy, the communication skills, resource management, advocacy for the online. We know that one of the key roles that this leader plays is in helping promote buy-in. And so ensuring that the online programs that are offered are in high esteem and really advocating for this, so important. And of course, there's this huge faculty development piece, supporting faculty in their teaching and their course creation. And then the marketing and promotion of these online offerings is another skill set that's just hugely important and should be considered in the hiring of that role. Okay. The Academic Council on Education noted that academic leaders are required to oversee academic visioning, accountability, accreditation, strategic planning, supervision and management, faculty advocacy, budgeting, and enrollment management. So you're hearing the tableau of skills emerge here. And it's just, when you think about crafting a job description, and finding an individual who has all of these abilities, it really is a very specialized skill set, and one that requires years and years of preparation to be able to tap into these skills. Now, one of the things that I have found in my own professional experience, and this is anecdotal, but I think most of us who know folks in this role, who have served in this role, recognize that an understanding of how to leverage others is also important, because we may not have all of these skills readily at our disposal. So having the wherewithal to know where to seek external support is also a key skill for this role. Let's talk a little bit about this replication of this study. So again, I explored job vacancy postings for the senior online leader and coded those, found them located on job postings and also institutional websites that had openings posted. Using a structure analysis, I created a sort of a skill type for coding to classify specific leadership criteria based on the following categories. So leadership, and again, you're going to hear some of these buckets that we've kind of identified. Leadership, technology, personnel management, curriculum and instruction, education, and I want to put an asterisk in your thought bubble around education, because that's an interesting finding. Relationship building, and then other. This was sort of stuff that didn't nicely fit in one of those buckets. So a total of 50 job descriptions were evaluated, and the themes that emerged were compared to the skills that were identified in the literature, these skills that we've been talking about, particularly to find out if there was a gap in what we know is needed in this role and what's being called for in this role. In order to make sure that I was capturing a wide swath of jobs that fell into this role, I looked up keywords like distance education jobs, vice provost of distance education, digital learning executive, online education jobs, and just sort of scrubbed through to find those publicly available postings. Okay. So Let's talk about the results. So in the first research question that I asked was, what are institutional expectations for skills of the Chief Online Learning Officer as identified in the job posting? So you see here the buckets that sort of the thematic buckets that the data were lumped into. So those 50 job postings were coded. A total of 716 job requirements were reviewed and coded. And so let's look at the first one, education. So education requirements were identified as a requirement in 100% of the job descriptions. And they comprised 80 of the overall skills outlined in the vacancy postings. So education in this context meant required doctoral degree or required terminal degree or master's degree or higher. So there were a variety of sort of ways of naming what that looked like, but they all fell into this sort of educational qualification bucket. The second category here, relationship building, was also identified in 100% of the job description requirements and comprised 202 of the skills that were reviewed. Relationship building included things like collaborating across departments. And you'll probably recognize some of these job description requirements and jobs that you've applied for. Relationship building, developing external and internal partnerships, professional networking, coordinating with academic units, that sort of language. Curriculum is next. It was identified in 65% of the job descriptions and comprised 45 of the overall skills outlined in vacancy postings. Curriculum included items like being responsible for curricular evaluation and development, overseeing online course design, managing and improving curriculum, aligning curriculum with quality metrics, accreditation standards, and expanding online program offerings. Personnel was identified in 75% of the job description requirements and comprised 81 of those skills. Personnel included things like holding faculty accountable. That was an interesting one. Supporting training and faculty development, establishing online advisory boards, overseeing online faculty, and conducting tenure and promotion reviews. Next is technology. Technology showed up in 35% of the postings and was 45 of the skills identified in the vacancies. Technology included things like multimedia usage, overseeing software applications, exhibiting proficiency in digital tools, and managing the LMS. Finally, leadership. Leadership was identified as a requirement in 100% of those job descriptions. No surprise there. It comprised 263 of the overall skills outlined in the vacancy posting. Leadership included things like academic leadership, serving as the chief academic officer, managing and improving process, strategic planning, driving mission and vision. All right. So question number 2 was, what are the Chief Online Learning Officer leadership skill requirements as noted in the literature? Of course, we have been talking extensively about this. So synthesized from all of those great studies, including our wonderful GEOs, were things like overseeing software applications, exhibiting proficiency in digital tools, managing the learning management system, leadership, collaboration, instructional design, faculty training and development, marketing, advocacy, ad nauseum, et al. Oh, professionalism was also one that came up a lot. So, all right, so research question 3. Okay, so this question was, what differences exist between institutional expectations? So those were the ones that were outlined in the job description. What did they think they need versus what does the literature say that they need. And so, as you know and have heard, so many of those skills, the skills required for this role, are really diverse. And based on the themes that emerged from these analyses, a comparison was made to find gaps, and there are some gaps. So this chart really captures those gaps, if you will. So across the top, we've got our themes from our analysis of those jobs and the buckets that we put those skills into. And then we've got down the side, we've got the skills that were noted in the literature as important to this role, what anyone fulfilling this chief online role really needs to be able to do. So as you can see, while advocacy and marketing were the only items that didn't map directly to a theme, there were other skills that really weren't explicitly captured in the job descriptions, including promoting growth of the online program, student success, engagement, instructional design, and resource allocation. So let's talk about that asterisk in your thought bubble. Education is not mentioned in the literature as a competency requirement, but it was outlined in 100% of the job vacancies reviewed. So we're putting a primary emphasis on some sort of educational preparation, when in fact, nowhere in the literature does it say that education is a necessary component for success in this role, which is really interesting to think about what that means. And I haven't unpacked that yet because there's a lot to think about there and a lot more questions that raises than answers. So if you're interested in this area, that would be a great thing to do some further research on. Okay. So getting down to the very end of my thoughts, and then I'm so eager to hear your questions and ideas. So any gap that is identified between the skills that are needed in a job and the skills that are being called for in the job description, vacancy postings, can have profound consequences, of course, for mission fulfillment in terms of the leader being able to be effective and oversee the online suite. So we need to be thoughtful about that and making sure that the skills that we're calling for in this role are in fact the skills that this individual will need to be successful. Of course, there are institutional particulars that have to be considered, and so there's not likely to be a one size fits all. But as you can see, there is a lot of overlap in some of the best practices that are emerging in this role, and some of the ways that this role will need to continue to drive the future of this space that we all know and love so much. What's clear is that this role is a senior leadership position, and this individual needs to be comfortable with innovation, needs to be comfortable with planning for a world of tomorrow that doesn't yet exist today. And they also need to have the authority to execute their vision. And so it's important that this job be positioned within the very top administration at the institution for it to be able to grow and evolve and continue to be effective. I strongly recommend replication of this study because, as you all know, we are not out of this pandemic and there are still implications. I have actually seen more of my friends and colleagues coming down with whatever this new strain of COVID is in the past few weeks than feels like we've sort of got a resurgence. And so I think as long as this is upon us, we need to not think of this as a closed chapter and, oh, there's already things we can take away from this. I think there's still a lot of learning to do around this area. So please continue to think about this and do research in this area. So UNESCO conducted research showing how higher educations were generally unprepared for the COVID-19 disruption. Good management practices, as we know now, were based on flexibility, strong communication, crisis team creation, digitization, and effective remote work processes. And where those weren't evident, we had a lot of chaos and a lot of damage to undo. Services were greatly impacted, and virtual delivery was dependent on the availability of infrastructure. Where there was an infrastructure, there wasn't really an opportunity to do this well. Institutional finances, we know, took a big hit. I mean, when students didn't move into their dorms and pay their athletic fees and all of the things, the dining hall fee, all of the things that go along with that face-to-face learning model really disrupted so much of our institutional processes. One of the more concerning things, of course, that has come out of this is that the mental health of students, faculty, and staff was a real issue and continues to be. And I am pleased to see that more institutions are really attending to this and ensuring that there are wraparound services for educational stakeholders in need. And we're going to need to continue to invest in ways to support that social emotional aspect of our colleagues and our students. The pandemic changed the nature of teaching and learning, and it required, really a radical and immediate shift to online. For many of us, it was business as usual, but for most of us, that was really very different than anything we'd been called to do professionally. And it created some fear and some angst and anguish and professional questioning. And so as we think about how to do this well going forward, we need to think about contingency planning and preparing for the next what if, so that when we're in a situation where we have to pivot and quickly implement a new way of being, that we have what's needed. And a leader who can oversee that vision is really critical to institutional success. As the pandemic continues to unfold, of course, the long-lasting effects are far from being settled. Interestingly, this sort of rapid return to in-person teaching and learning and the stabilization of enrollment that's happened over the past 18 months suggests that the changes of 2020 and early 2021 may not lead to just sort of a fundamental transformation in the core of how we do higher education. But I think the disruption has been enough to make the role of online a wedded part of how we do what we do in higher education. We can really build, we can seek the momentum of this and build on it so that we're better prepared to ensure uninterrupted learning if any contingencies do emerge in the future. Romeo et al. Did a recent study that showed negative outcomes from the pandemic that included declines in student engagement, declines in their work and career readiness. So when you think about ripple effect and implications that are going to have a long-term consequences, we've got a cohort of students who really did not have the preparation they needed to be successful transitioning into the workforce. There were broad academic declines. We've seen this from K-12 all the way up through higher education, and I think we're going to continue to see this. A lot of students didn't learn well in this way, and so we're going to see some consequences of that. We also have to not forget the huge discomfort of social isolation that happened, and so this leader needs to be thoughtful about all of these consequences and continue to think about how that will shape what needs to be enacted in our institutions. This role is uniquely positioned to help institutions navigate this new reality, where intentional online is not only possible, but desirable. The role needs to be afforded the flexibility and power it needs to leverage online and for today and for tomorrow. This person should report to the highest levels of the administration so that they can shape the landscape and the synergy between innovation, technology, and learning. The role really does need to be unsiloed, decoupled from its little garage off campus, and invited into the wider campus community so that people understand who this person is, what this role is, and how it can support what they need to be doing. Successful implementation of this position depends on adaptability and support from the leaders in any institution. Our senior leaders bear the responsibility for communicating how an organization's overall mission and strategic plan ultimately embrace this role and investment in online learning. And I'm so grateful that you all are doing this work with me and are at the helm of shaping what this looks like. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to field any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw.
My pleasure.
We extended an invitation for questions on chat. There's a little bit of a lag between our Zoom and the live broadcast, so we'll give that a moment.
Perfect.
Wow, this is really fascinating, and I'm so grateful that you revisited the initial study.
It was needed. It's like an outfit that no longer fits. You have to go back, and I think so much of the research that we did before needs to be redone because boy, a lot has changed over the past few years. And Gio, I'm so thrilled that I was able to draw from the good work that you've done in extending this idea. And I again, anybody who hasn't read that research really would enjoy it. It informs a lot of this needed power and authority that's important in this role.
Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, one of the biggest challenges in conducting my research was that, as you mentioned earlier, we have not really settled on a broadly accepted title for the position.
Yes.
So it's very hard to find these professionals. And my study had a lower response rate than I would have liked for it to have. So I'm hoping to revisit it. Anyone interested to collaborate, please reach out.
That's great. Yeah, it's, even defining who this person is in any one institution can be a challenge. And you're right, it's not only the naming of the title and that there's not really sort of a go-to naming convention, but also the just huge, vast variety of ways that this role is envisioned. Is it a part of the C-suite? Is it a dean in a college? Is it sort of a centralized role? Is it something that's siloed and online is kind of completely apart from the rest of the curriculum that's happening? It's really interesting and difficult to drill down in exactly what it is and who it is and where it is.
So I wonder, from your research, what would you say to someone who is currently serving as a Chief Online Learning Officer, but perhaps whose position was introduced at lower levels of the hierarchy? And they heard you speak today, and they heard your message that this position really needs to be a C-suite to have the authority to impact all the pieces of the puzzle. What sort of arguments, what kind of ammunition could such a person have in bringing up a conversation with their senior executive leaders?
Yeah, great question. I think it's sort of a two-part answer. The first is the research is on your side. So there's a growing body of evidence of the importance of this role. And so I think it can be compelling to support your position in the research and sort of ground an argument around where this role would best lie. in terms of authority and title and all of that. The other thing, you know, keeping track of the responsibilities that one is undertaking. You can even think of it as sort of writing your own job description. What exactly are the things that you're doing? And quantifying that in terms of the institution to show how impactful the role is can really be a good way of sort of selling yourself and the importance of positionality of this role. You know, data is our friend whenever we're wanting to justify our importance in an institution. So use the data from the pandemic and the consequences and negative things that will have long-standing impact, and demonstrate the value of having that infrastructure in place and how the institutions that do this well fared better. And I think all of these things can be a great way to advocate for yourself and for your position in your institution.
Absolutely. And to our audience member, if you missed Dr. Tony Pena's talk on Tuesday, please revisit it. He made some excellent points about common errors related to the Chief Online Education Officer position. And the first one he mentioned was that whenever an institution creates such a position driven solely by an intent to increase enrollment and revenue, that's sort of a way to miss the mark.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, I think a lot of leaders who aren't as familiar with the importance of online education, it's really about preparing our students with 21st century learning skills. You know, that's what we do. And giving them accessibility in ways that they don't have in traditional programs. But that doesn't mean that, you know, we're going to have students beating down the door because we create a new online program. Ideally, a nice side effect of our innovation is that students are intrigued and do want to be a part of it. But the landscape has shifted so much, and there are so much competition. There's just so many players in this space now that it really is hard to garner market share in the ways that, you know, the sort of dollar signs in the eyes we used to think of online as the cash cow for the institution. You know, another thing, and Tony Pena is so brilliant in this space and thinking about this, and I don't know, I wasn't able to listen in, but look forward to hearing the recording. But one of the things that I've thought about is some of the outsourcing that needs to happen when you don't have all of these skill sets and you're expected to do so many things. But be thinking about, if you do get into a partnership external from the institution, at inception, be thinking about the divorce from that contract and what that looks like. Because ideally, the more we can keep in-house, the better control over quality and cost, and, you know, all of that happens. So as we start thinking about partnering with enablers, always think about that end game and how do you walk it back when you're ready to support the endeavor on your own. I think that's another important misstep that a lot of folks make, is get into long-term contracts and with partners that are difficult to disentangle down the road.
That's a great point. And a title just came out recently, in-house or outsource, Chief Online Learning Officers decision-making factors when considering OPM. Yeah,
read that and keep that in your professional library. Such an important consideration for anyone in this role.
Yeah, I just shared it on chat if anyone's interested.
Perfect.
Something else I was wondering, sort of tangential to the study that you just undertook, as you were looking at those 50-something descriptions, prior to the pandemic, I believe all positions were based on a specific campus. I wonder if you've seen any of these positions now move to being remote.
Yes. Interestingly, there's still a lot of reliance on these, depending on the level of leadership. The higher the level, the more likely that position is going to be ground-based. I'm seeing a little bit of shift in that, but there's still an overall distrust in the ability to do this work remote or any sort of administrative work remote. I think we disrupted instruction enough that now we think, oh, okay, we actually can do teaching remote. Some not as well as others, but I think that we need to continue to demonstrate, again, use data, it's your friend. We know that it is more cost effective to have these positions be remote. So negotiate that and use data to support the doability of this job remote, because it really can be done. And in fact, I would argue that it's modeling best practices by being able to do it remotely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And UNESCO has these 17 goals for sustainable development. One of them has to do with climate change. So what better way to contribute to carbon neutrality than to encourage virtual work whenever possible, and of course with support in place, with training in place. And
I did a study with a colleague of mine many years ago, and I'm sure the data are old, but in looking at the cost savings, it was something like $14,000 per year per employee that the organization saved by having them work remote. So it's good for all of us. And clearly there are some things that need to be campus based, and I understand that, but if there's possibilities, even if it's partially remote, Gio, you're absolutely right, the benefits are compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. As we wrap up, do you have any sort of biggest takeaways, or what would you say to people who are perhaps now in process of choosing an area to conduct research, maybe for their doctoral program? Where would you encourage us to explore more, to build to the body of literature?
Yeah, the big takeaway for me is we were making really great strides in proving the quality and equity of online education before the pandemic. And instead of all of a sudden it becoming the panacea for everything, because there was some unintentional consequences of our rapid pivot to online, there's some damage that has to be undone. So those of us who are comfortable with being advocates for online, we're going to need to speak louder than we ever have about the benefits of this way of learning and working, and continue to triage some of those unintentional consequences and help remedy those. I think that's the takeaway. I hope you all, and by the way, you're all amazing. Anyone doing this role, you have such a panoply of skills. It's incredible, and every institution is lucky to have you. So those are my takeaways. Research, oh boy, there's so many gaps here, right? So many things we don't know. And so whenever you are interested in furthering the field, think about the problems that we don't yet know how to solve, and let your research be the vehicle through which we test solutions. And so, yeah, I've given you some things to think about in this. For a small example is this gap in every job description said there's something important about education, yet nothing in the literature says education really matters. So poking at that a little bit would be a really interesting study. I think continuing to look at these skills that are needed as we emerge from the pandemic and get on the other side of it. And then, of course, finding things to remedy that resulted from poorly executed online. And it happened. And it happened a lot with those faculty who were really comfortable with the direct instruction lecture type teaching and just translated that and put all of their lectures on Zoom and had the students just sit for hours at a time watching, very passively learning. So a lot to reclaim there, and hopefully your research can help begin to chip away at some of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for having me. What a delight. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. We appreciate all of you for participating, for getting engaged. Before you leave, please take a moment to fill out our anonymous survey to help us continue to bring to you programming that is relevant to you, to your interests. There's now a link in chat. Dr. Shaw, thank you so much for all the work that you do. Please continue writing and researching and speaking. We're all learning from you and benefiting from your wisdom.
Thank you so much. You as well.
Oh, thank you kindly. All right. Well, another big thanks to our sponsors, and we hope that you will join us tomorrow for day 4, where we're going to hear from Melanie Booth and Emily Jacobson, who will talk about SARA resources, helping colleges and universities with distance education, and then from Dr. Lisa Clark, who will talk about leadership decisions and faculty training for online teaching and learning. So please join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely afternoon and see you back tomorrow. Take care.